Cari amici, dear friends, ben trovati. Welcome to this program celebrating the great Dante Alighieri. Today we have an incredibly vast audience, almost 800 participants, joining us from all of the United States, from California to New York State, but also from Canada, Italy. I can see some registered from Argentina, many from the UK, France, Germany, a couple of users even from Jakarta and Australia. I hope that you're all doing well and staying healthy wherever in the world you are in these trying days. For those of you who are joining us for the first time, let me introduce myself. I am Emanuele Amendola, the director of the Italian Cultural Institute in Washington, D.C. Thank you for being with us. This year, as you might know, Italy commemorates the 700th anniversary of the death of Dante Alighieri. A very important anniversary because Dante is really a fundamental figure for our culture, for our language, and therefore for our identity. For this anniversary, the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C. and its cultural and consular network organized more than 60 events that will take place throughout the year and throughout the country. Lectures, exhibitions, film screenings, dance performances, a testimony and a reflection of the universality of Dante's work and of his immense cultural impact and legacy, as our ambassador Armando Barricchio remarked. Besides the Embassy of Italy in Washington, D.C., I also would like to acknowledge the support of my colleagues directing the other 6 Italian Cultural Institutes in North America, and more specifically, Director Fabio Finotti in New York, together with colleague Paolo Barlela, Luca Di Vito at the Italian Cultural Institute in Chicago, Anna Maria Di Giorgio in San Francisco, Valeria Rumori in Los Angeles, Francesco Darelli in Montreal, and Veronica Manson in Toronto. Thank you for co-presenting this program with us. Today, we are going to explore some, let's say, non-orthodox ideas that Dante expressed in his Commedia, and more specifically, his idea of others, whether these others were women, homosexuals, or non-Christians. A topic that I'm sure we will feel as very current and relevant, notwithstanding that fact that we're talking about an author who died 700 years ago. And we have the honor of discussing such themes with one of the most regarded and appreciated scholars in the field, Teodolinda Barolini. Teodolinda Barolini is Lorenzo da Ponte Professor of Italian at Columbia University. She's a member of the Accademia Nazionale dei Lincei and the Accademia Olimpica, as well as a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and of the American Philosophical Society. She was also the 15th president of the Dante Society of America. Professor Barolini is the author of many important books on Dante, such as Dante's Poets, The Divina Commedia, Dante and the Origins of Italian Literary Culture, but also, and more recently, Professor Barolini penned with her sister, Susanna, an anthology of the diaries of their father, Antonio Barolini, who was also a successful writer and an important journalist. And this collection of writings is an important evidence of the years which led to the liberation of Italy from the Nazi and fascist regimes. Professor Barolini is also the editor-in-chief of Columbia's Digital Dante website, and she has written the first online commentary to the 100 canti of the Commedia, the so-called Commento Baroliniano. So it is quite appropriate, I would say, to have her with us on Zoom. Before giving the floor to Professor Barolini, I just would like to remind you that we will be taking questions for our speaker at the end of the presentation. You can type your questions or comments at any time in the chat or the Q&A sections of your Zoom client, and we will try to answer to as many as possible at the end of the presentation. Professoressa, è un grande onore e piacere averla qui con noi per celebrare Dante. Thank you so much for being with us today. The screen is yours.
Well, I wish I were with you, Emanuele, but on the other hand, that seems a little bit ungrateful because one has to think of poor Boccaccio dealing with the plague of 1348 without the help of Zoom. And when you put it to yourself in that way, you begin to think that really we are quite fortunate. So first of all, thank you so much to you and to Ambassador 𝗗𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗵 for this very kind invitation. And I think, oh yes, I also want to say that the images come to you thanks to your extraordinary technical support, 𝗗𝗗liche 𝗓𝗿, because I cannot handle the PowerPoint and the presentation at the same time. So thank you to all, and shall I begin? Yes, okay. So this afternoon, my topic is Dante's Others, a category. Now I'm going to just do a few introductory remarks, and then we will be looking at the images, and I will only be reading occasionally. A category that I will take in a broad sense to include sexual, racial, and religious difference. Over the last years, I have been working to verify an idea that has come to me to seem more and more indisputably true. That is the idea that Dante was more progressive in the context of what we would call social justice issues than were many of his peers, his contemporaries. So my question today is, to what degree is Dante, who as a person and as an intellectual was passionately committed to justice and who possessed, and this is important, a non-stereotyping imagination, to what degree was he able to see past some of the blind spots of his historical time on Earth? Of course, Dante was not literally divine, and he was not endowed with a divine ability to see past all historical blind spots of his time. No one can completely evade being a creature of her or his own historical time, and Dante is no exception. But Dante was endowed with a particularly vivid imagination, and I will attempt to show how he used that capacity to think outside of the box in social terms. Again, I want to be clear, it is not my goal to whitewash Dante or to present him as what he could not possibly be. I can cite examples of misogyny and anti-Semitism and Islamophobia in his writing, but I can also cite examples of the contrary, which is less true of his contemporaries than it is of him. And therefore, I think it is important to give some attention in order to really have historical accuracy, not only to the ways in which he defaults to what was the default of living 700 years ago, but also to the ways in which he is able to think himself into, I would say, quite unusual positions with respect to his time. So I'm going to begin with the consideration of women. I will then move to showing the other categories I talked about. So I think we can start now, and we will start with the woman we all think of first when we think of Dante, namely 𝗗𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵. Okay, so we could go to the first slide. So 𝗗𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵, this is a painting by Dante Gabriele Rossetti, English painter, who founded the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. And here, what I want to communicate is really in that last name with a question mark. The name Portinari we get from Boccaccio. I put the question mark because we don't know absolutely that she was a Portinari, but we always say that because Boccaccio, after all, was born in 1313 when Dante was still alive. You all know that he died in 1321. That's why we're celebrating him in 2021. And therefore, that's a pretty close historical witness, and he gives us this name. But what's important in any case is that she is historical, that she truly existed, that he always presents her in all of his writing as a truly existent historical person. She is not an allegory. She is not a symbol. She is not Lady Philosophy, as in, say, Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. This is important for a variety of reasons, but one is that, therefore, when he has her behave in certain ways, that is more of a challenge to orthodoxy than it would be had he called her Lady Philosophy. So let's just think about how he has her behave, and we'll go to the next slide. And this is going to be Dante Gabriele Rossetti again. And I really just used this because he uses the word Beatrix for her name, Beatrice, as I do too. And I'm going to show you in the next slide how I use the word Beatrix for her. And it's in this tag that I first came up with in my book, The Undivine Comedy from 1992, but that I have since used a lot. Beatrix loquax, Beatrice who speaks, Beatrice who speaks a lot. And really, that beautiful terzina from Inferno 2 that's on your screen, for most of my life, I read it with the emphasis on amor mi mosse, but at a certain point, I began to put a lot of emphasis on che mi fa parlare, because that is what the lyric lady of Dante's youth never did. She never spoke. The ladies of his early poems, he started out as a courtly poet, they do not speak. And in Beatrice, he comes up with a historically existent, non-allegorical female figure who is endowed with an authority that allows her to speak. And we'll go to, well, I just want to give you two scholarly contextualizations. This is a comment from a 1988 book, which says Beatrice in the Vita Nuova appears far more persuasive, enigmatic, explosive than the recreated and cantankerous figure of the Purgatorio. Well, what's the difference? She doesn't speak in the Vita Nuova. She has plenty to say when Dante meets her in the Purgatorio, and when he describes her as an admiral on her ship. In other words, she is a commanding figure of authority. She's not a nice lady, as, say, Matilda, who we just met, and who I think many readers expect Beatrice to be like. What's going on with Beatrice is instead, and we could go to the next slide, something that Botticelli, even in his gentle way, captures here, where he shows her in the Paradiso as a teacher. And notice he makes her much bigger than her pupil. And this all the way through the Paradiso, this is pretty much what their sizes will be. And all the way through the Paradiso, she is lecturing, she is speaking. And Botticelli actually does capture that. And I gave you one verse, the verse that is really quite stunning in Paradiso 7, where Beatrice says, secondo mio infallibile avviso, where the adjective infallibile ascribed to a female speaker seems to me quite remarkable and important. So this is a context of what he does with Beatrice, who, on the other hand, is not, even though it is important that she is historical, she is not given much historical specificity in the way that he portrays her, in the sense that we don't learn about her what we learn, say, about Picarda Donati. So let's look at some of the other, but in fact, many of these characters we know very little about. The next one, Pia de Tolomei, if you could, we know really almost nothing about, except what she tells us, which is fundamentally that she too, like Francesca da Rimini, was killed by her husband. So this would be a second example of 𝗗𝗄𝗓icide in the Commedia. And then Picarda Donati, in the next slide, tells us that she was violently abducted from the sweet cloister. She had gone into a nunnery, and as she says in the second terzina, uomini poi a mal più che a ben usi, for mi rapiron dalla dolce chiostra. And you know, maybe you're accustomed to thinking that nobody would ever want to go into a nunnery, but in fact, if you read historians like 𝗗𝗵𝗁 𝗔𝗵 on Florentine history, you will understand that for many women, actually, it wasn't the Monaca di Monza story. It was instead quite a respectable alternative to marriage, which had its own problems. So here, she is abducted from the cloister, and we could go to the next, which is a picture, a 19th century Italian painter who shows Picarda in the center with some nuns pulling her in their direction, and then her brother's violent thugs pulling her in the other direction. And why is she being abducted from the cloister? She's being abducted so that she can be a political pawn of her brother Corso Donati, a dynastic wife. And the topic of dynastic wife is going to bring us to 𝗓𝗕sca da Rimini. So let me say something with respect to 𝗓𝗕sca. We could switch now to the next slide. I gave this one the title, 𝗓𝗕sca da Polenta of Ravenna, married 𝗗𝗏𝗄 Malatesta of Rimini. That's 𝗗𝗏𝗄 in the background waiting to kill 𝗓𝗕sca with her lover, 𝗗𝗏𝗄's brother, Paolo. But the point I want to make here is that Dante's story, as he tells it in Inferno 5, doesn't seem to have much history. But if we study it properly, we can learn quite a lot. And the first thing actually that tells us a lot is that the commentators have no information about her other than what they learned from Dante. So I did some work on this issue of historicizing 𝗓𝗕sca. I found that the only document prior to a commentator of the Divine Comedy, so the only pre-Dante recording of her name, so that her existence, the fact that she ever lived would even be known, is in the will of her father-in-law, 𝗗𝗏𝗄's father, who founded the Malatesta dynasty in Rimini. And he refers to the dowry of the late Lady 𝗓𝗕sca. So after she was dead, he is indicating how her dowry should be disposed. That is the only historical record of 𝗓𝗕sca prior to the existence of the Divine Comedy. So the story of the real 𝗓𝗕sca is the story of a dynastic pawn. In fact, if you look at those three women, 𝗓𝗕sca, Pia, Picarda, they all have in common situations of abuse, of victimhood. And I believe that the study of Dante and of his women in the future will have to really make much more of an attempt to consider the ways in which he is attracted by, he cares to feature in his poem women who have suffered. And in the case of 𝗓𝗕sca, the point that seems to me extremely important is that not the fictional point. The fictional point is that she's in hell. The true point outside of the fiction is that we would not know she existed were it not for Dante Alighieri. So while he puts her in his Inferno, he also gave her historical life. I think he is her historian of record. Now there's something else, and now I'm going to talk about that picture. He also gives her agency. He gives her agency. In Inferno 5, she's the one who's doing all the talking. She's the one who presents herself as a person who made choices, and spectacularly and very interestingly, he makes her a reader. So let's look at the next slide. And there's John Flaxman, again, Gianciotto hiding, waiting to pounce on them. And the illustrators over the centuries were always drawn to this scene, which is the culminating scene of her story, where she says how she and Paolo were one day reading together per diletto, for delight. And they came to the point where Lancelot kisses Guinevere and then Paolo kisses her. And then she famously says, then that day we read no more. And this is the scene here. The point that I would like to emphasize about it is that it is a scene of a woman trying in some way to make a destiny different from the dynastic one to which she had been condemned. A great receiver of the story of Francesca is Boccaccio. And Boccaccio goes so far as to make her not guilty. Why? Because he says she was forced to marry Gianciotto, and she had already fallen in love with Paolo. Now, this is Boccaccio. He is a famous writer of novelle. He obviously elaborates, but he elaborates in the direction of pointing out that her agency had been denied her. And he makes that point very, very forcefully by saying she and Paolo had met. In fact, he goes even further. He says that she was deceived. He says that when the Malatesta came to make the accord with the Polenta family, they brought Paolo, and she saw Paolo and he was handsome and they fell in love. Then subsequently, she was married to Gianciotto. Okay, moving on. Now we are going to the topic of lust. Francesca is in Inferno 5, which is the second circle of hell, and it is the circle of lust. Here you see a detail from Giotto's 𝗗𝗍𝗶 Chapel, Last Judgment. And I'm going to read to you the comments of art historians so that you can see what you're looking at. This is art historians Anna Durbis and Mark Sandona, who this is their language. They refer to torments directed at genitalia. And they say near Satan's left hip. So if you locate Satan's left hip, a scaly green monster gnaws on one man's penis. Above them, a black demon grabs another man's genitals in pincers. Now, why is this? Is this just Giotto? No, it isn't. This is a 1,000-year-long tradition in vision literature, in which the way in which vision literature expresses the punishment is almost always through the idea of torture directed at the member, the body part that is sinning. So we're talking about lust. We're going to have what those art historians call tortures directed at genitalia. And you can find this, you can go back, you can get that handy little book, Visions of Heaven and Hell before Dante, where you can read them in translation. St. Paul's Apocalypse, St. Peter's Apocalypse, there's a whole tradition of vision literature. But then there is also this same tradition goes into painting. And so Giotto is simply inheriting here an absolute commonplace, a topos of thinking about the Last Judgment and thinking about sin and punishment, which is that punishment will take the form, to the degree that you can figure out how that would happen, of punishment directed at the part that sins. So that's the first slide of Giotto. The next one, same, it's a detail from the same Last Judgment. And here you can see, if you look carefully, you can see the devil with the pincers on that man in the center. And then you can see also the female figure hanging from her hair. This is also a common way of dealing with luxuria in women, to consider hair as the sinning member because it's used for concupiscence, as preachers and vision authors say. So you can see where I'm going. Well, actually, maybe you don't see where I'm going. Where I'm going is to say that there is no such thing in the Divine Comedy. There are no devils with pincers on men's penises. There are no women hanging from their hair. There's nothing of this sort at all. And yet, those same art historians that I was just citing, right after the passage I read you, they wrote, these particular forms of torture, surely visual versions of Dantean contrappasso are especially apt. Okay, so these are not visual versions of Dantean contrappasso. There is nowhere in the Divine Comedy sexualized punishment. That's one of the points that I want to make. The other point there is how the reception of an author, how our perception of an author sediments over time, and actual enormous inaccuracies can enter reputable scholarly literature, like the statement that what we're looking at on the screen is a visual version of a Dantean contrappasso. So what is the contrappasso of Inferno 5? It's nothing like we see in Giotto's treatment of the lustful. Oh, I'm sorry, you have to see one more example of a sexualized torment. This is Taddeo di Bartolo. This painting, this is his Last Judgment from the Collegiata di San Gimignano. And this is his treatment of luxuria, which could not be more explicitly a sexualized torment. I think you can see enough there to see that. So moving on, what do we find in Inferno 5? What we find is a bufera, a whirlwind that tosses the souls. If you look at the quotes on the left, how is this bufera, this hellish hurricane, characterized? As never resting, as driving the spirits with its violence. And then Dante explains slightly later that this is the torment of carnal sinners. And then he defines carnal sinners, che la ragion sommettono al talento, that they put their reason, they subordinated their reason, they put it under their desire. So what is Dante interested in? He's not interested in the word that runs through all the preachers, fornication. He spends no time on that. He's interested in the psychology of desire, the misalignment of the faculties that occurs when we subordinate reason, which should be in control, to desire. Not that desire has to be eliminated. Desire is necessary. Desio che è moto spirituale, as Dante will say in Purgatorio 18. You're not going to get anywhere without desire. You're not going to get to God without desire. But desire must always be controlled by reason. If you subordinate reason to desire, you could very well end up like this, whirled around by a hurricane that does what? Like most of Dante's contrapassi, they are literalized metaphors, and this bufera tosses them about in the same way that their passions controlled them and tossed them about while they were alive. Again, no sexualized torment, rather a torment that is intended to indicate what Dante thinks is at stake, which is a problem of the will that does not remain controlled by reason, but that rather allows itself to be dominated by desire. So if we continue, Pasquale will show us here we just have more examples of Inferno 5, and you can see just simply the same thing. There are Paolo and Francesca, leggeri, blown by the wind, stopping to talk to Dante. And Virgilio, there's a movie by Lina Wertmüller, whose title is an exact, maybe director Amendola can remember that title, Travolti, something like that. And that is precisely the exact same metaphor that Dante is using here. Okay, so let's see what comes next. There we have Blake. I'm just showing you pretty pictures now. This is Blake's Bufera in Inferno 5. And then here we have Doré, and I think that's going to be it. The next, please. Okay, now this is an awful image. This is, we've now moved to sodomy. This is Taddeo di Bartolo again from the Collegiata di San Gimignano. And it is labeled by him. It's actually, the word is on the hat of the sinner. It is labeled by him sodomito. And to go back to those art historians that I was citing before, they describe this as a soul who is, I can't actually find that at the moment, but they say skewered. They use the word skewered, and you can see the skewer that is running through him. So here we have sodomy. Let's move to the next. This is Dante's treatment of sodomy in Inferno 15. The souls are pelted by an eternal rain of fire. So I don't want to get here into this is a worse punishment, this is a better punishment. I really don't want to get into that. I'm simply trying to say it's not a sexualized punishment. Dante is not drawn to the typical imagery. That's why I'm using the images. I'm using them as a shorthand to show you, because I could read you many passages from preachers and from vision literature. Dante simply is not drawn to the typical way of portraying sexual sin. And he doesn't. In the case of luxuria, we saw that he makes it a question of the alignment of the faculties. In the case of sodomy, he classifies sodomy as violence against nature, and he treats the sodomites in Inferno 15 and 16 as an opportunity to discuss corruption in Florence. They're all Florentines. All the sodomites of Inferno 15 and 16 are Florentines. Here is Brunetto Latini, who died in 1294. You know, he was Dante's teacher. They have a very touching encounter. In the next canto, Canto 16, if you switch slides, you see them dancing. Well, they're not dancing. They're like, Dante has a long simile comparing them to wrestlers moving around in a circle as they prepare to wrestle. Those are the three Florentines who are still in the classification of sodomy in Inferno 16. I think there's another slide of these. That's Blake's version of them. And then we probably also have Flaxman next. And there's Flaxman. Okay. So that's Dante's handling of sodomy in hell. I think we can all agree that it is not a sexualized treatment. So many people think that that is it for sodomy in the Divine Comedy. A few decades ago, I came across an article by then Prime Minister Andreotti against same-sex marriage. And he had the quote in it, "Don't forget, I sodomiti Dante li mette all'inferno." But he had to read further, because Dante also puts them in the Purgatorio. And that's rather a huge issue. It's extremely non-normative. I can't speak about this in terms of orthodox or heterodox because it's really not straightforward from that point of view, but it's absolutely not normative. Nobody would have complained had he not put sodomites in purgatory, had he never mentioned them again. And in fact, most commentaries until very recently don't even really pay attention to the fact that he put sodomites in purgatory. Why do I keep saying that? Sodomites in purgatory? That means they're saved. Everybody in purgatory is saved. From the minute we enter purgatory, every soul we encounter in Dante's Purgatorio is saved, except for poor Virgilio, of course. And so when we get to the terrace of lust in purgatory, that's the first thing that's important. The circle of lust in hell only had heterosexual lust. Sodomites he puts as violent against nature. What made Dante reclassify when he gets to purgatory? Well, purgatory has a much simpler form of classification. It only has the seven deadly vices as its taxonomic scheme. So when he gets to purgatory, where he has the 7 vices, 7 terraces in purgatory corresponding to the 7 vices, and the top terrace is the terrace of lust. And when he gets to the terrace of lust, he could simply have put heterosexual lovers purging their lust on their way to paradise. No one, as I said, would have complained. And yet Dante doesn't. He does something else. If we go to the next slide, you will see. Now it's hard to see because these are manuscripts and it's hard to see, but there are 2 groups of souls. Maybe it's clearer in the next slide. Well, you can see on the bottom one, the 2 groups of souls meeting each other. And these are all manuscript illustrations, but I think the next one is Flaxman, and there it might be easier to see. Yes, so what he says in Purgatorio 26 is that there are 2 groups of souls moving in opposite directions to each other, and he characterizes them. Of one group, he says that they are calling out as exemplary of their sin, Sodoma, and in the other group, they are not doing that. I'm not going to go in the direction of how he characterizes the heterosexual group, because that's got its own complexities, which are not my point here. My point here is that he goes out of his way to put a homosexual group on the terrace of lust. If you go back 2 slides, Pasquale. So if you look at that verse, that terzina, this is these are the verses characterizing the circle, the group that's in the circle that's of souls that is homosexual, and they are, he says that they are sharing the sin for which Caesar heard queen called out against him. 𝗧𝗲 triumphando, meaning Caesar, while he was a triumph in the technical sense, while he was parading through the streets of Rome in triumph after one of his military battles, he heard himself called by people on the sidelines, Regina. Dante read this in a Roman historian, likely Eusebius or someone like that. He knew it and this is actual information that he got from classical antiquity. The amazing thing is how he uses it, that he just uses it to characterize a group of souls in purgatory. And what's the implication of that? The implication of putting souls, both homosexual and heterosexual, on this terrace is finally the most important part of this. By doing that, Dante is suggesting that you can look at homosexual lust in the same way as heterosexual lust, which is it's only sinful if it's excessive. that is the whole point of how he's treating the heterosexuals. That's the whole point of the top terraces of purgatory. They are all about, from the moment that we get to avarice and then gluttony and then lust, his definition of those sins is that they are sins in which you desire the right object, but in the wrong way, e con troppo di vigore. It's very interesting to take that classification, which comes from Purgatorio 17, and apply it to homosexuality. Dante doesn't spell that out, but that would be the implication of taking seriously the classification of Canto 17 and then applying it to what we find in Canto 26. Okay, so moving on, we are now leaving sex completely behind us, and we are going to religious and racial others. And here I am relying on this extraordinary book by a scholar called Deborah Strickland, and I'm giving you the cover so you can see the art, the imagery that I take here, that I use for this section of my presentation, comes from this book, which is called Saracens, Demons, and Jews, Making Monsters in Medieval Art. And the category that I found her book extraordinarily useful for is particularly Jews, where she has some incredible images that got me to thinking in about one area in particular in which we could say that Dante is non-normative in his treatment of Jews. So the next slides are going to be all examples from Strickland of iconography of Jews, and the heading "Jews Stereotyped" is her caption from her book. And what she's showing there are that she explains our stereotypes for Jews are what she calls Phrygian caps, Phrygian, P-H-R-Y-G-I-N, and also the noses. So Christ, who's in the center, you will notice, doesn't have a cap and doesn't have the same kind of nose. So if we go to the next one, in the lower panel, if you look carefully, you might see that that is half of a hell mouth. There are depictions of hell as a mouth that is devouring sinners. And you can see the mouth rising up and the eye of the hell mouth. And those are Jews wearing their Phrygian caps going down into hell. Now, there are no Jews in Dante's hell. There is the name Giudecca, which certainly has Jewish connections, but there are no Jews in Dante's hell. There are the biblical, there are the Hebrew Pharisees among the hypocrites, to be completely. And then the next image, and this is the image that was most, this I just put in just to show you, but this one, yes, there you can see bottom panel, a very clear hell mouth. In the hell mouth is a cauldron. And then, unfortunately, the face is smudged. These are all very ancient, of course, but you can see that the figure in front has a money bag around his neck. And Strickland, who has studied these obviously firsthand, defines that figure as a Jew with a money bag. Also because money bags were always used as part of an iconography for Jews. And that is what got me thinking, because Dante does have money bags in one place in the Divine Comedy, and that is in Inferno 17, where he puts the usurers. And usurers were typically considered to be Jews, but instead Dante does something completely different. So if we go to the next slide, oh, here I am doing just a little bit of a shout out to the website, Digital Dante, but I'm also, this is a screenshot of a page of the commento. And in this case, I titled the commento to Inferno 17, Usury and the Absence of Jews. because I wanted to focus on what was unusual in Dante's handling of usury, which is precisely that he does not default to the typical medieval, especially in the north. I have to be honest, the Italian peninsula was not as bad for these stereotyping measures, but most of Strickland's artwork, in fact, comes from England, France, and Germany. So what does Dante do with his usurers? So again, this is a manuscript that you can, but if you look at the middle panel, you can see that the souls there have money bags around their necks, and Dante refers to them. If you look at the Italian, una tasca, right? A purse was hung. And what's really quite interesting is that he decides that each purse, to put on each purse, the heraldic insignia of the family of that sinner. And he, in the Italian, it goes in the passage that follows what I've given you, he details the insignia to such a degree, it's as though he's giving future illustrators instructions of what family crest to put on each of the 3 pouches. And they are the family crests of 3 famous, important Christian families, two of whom are Florentine, and the third of which is precisely the 𝗗𝗏 family of Padua, the very family that financed the 𝗗𝗏 chapel that we saw the Giotto in. So if I could find the right place in my notes here, the crests of the Florentine Gianfigliazzi, which is azure lion on a gold field, the Florentine 𝗗𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗏 family. We could try the next one and see if we have any clearer images. Well, you can see, so the 𝗗𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗏, no, if you could go back one, please, thank you. The 𝗗𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗏, you can see the middle figure has a duck. That's the 𝗗𝗶𝗵𝗵𝗏, not a duck, excuse me, white goose on a red field. And then the 𝗗𝗏. And so my point here is that Dante, when he treats usurers, he makes all the usurers Christian, and he makes it impossible not to know who they are by virtue of putting those crests that indicate their families. And then, to me, particularly interesting is that he uses the topos of the money bag, a topos that, as you saw from Strickland, was associated with Jews, but which he transfers instead to these Christian usurers. Okay, and now we're going to do another big switch in topic, and we're going to look at other kinds of non-Christians, especially pagans. And this is going to bring us to the topic of limbo. So this is the Budapest manuscript, and you can see in the top left the poets of the Bella Scuola whom Dante and Virgilio meet in limbo. And you can see in the bottom right that the illustrator has transitioned to Inferno 5, and that is Paolo and Francesca. The reason I'm using this is to show you that the souls of limbo are dressed, and they will be the only souls in the Inferno who are dressed in this manuscript. And this is part of the way an illustrator has understood the language of Inferno 4 and the constant repetition on the word honor, that these are honorable folk. And to show that, the illustrator dresses them. So I have to talk a little bit about the theology of limbo so that you understand perhaps the most the most heterodox of Dante's narrative decisions is his treatment of limbo. Limbo should contain, well, from an Orthodox perspective, limbo once contained the Hebrew matriarchs and patriarchs of the Bible. They were rescued from limbo by Christ after the crucifixion, when he harrowed hell, and those souls went to paradise. And Dante refers to them at the beginning of Inferno 4. After that, in an Orthodox understanding of limbo, after the departure of the adults, the biblical figures from the Bible, there should never be another adult in limbo. Limbo, after the departure of the biblical worthies, is the home of unbaptized children. Dante could not be less interested in those unbaptized children. Those unbaptized children are so important to the theology of limbo that in 2007, the Vatican published a document in which they basically reformed limbo to the point that it no longer exists, because they say that they want to hold out the hope that every child can be taken to heaven, even if we, the church, failed to give them the rite of baptism. And that's the whole point of limbo, is that everybody there has not had baptism. As Virgilio will say in the next slide, I think it's in the next slide. There we go. There's Virgilio speaking, and he's defining the souls of limbo. You can see them all looking very elegant and dignified with the nobile castello behind them in that manuscript. And he's saying they did not sin, but that wasn't enough, perché non ebber battesimo. They did not have baptism. And this is because they were dinanzi al cristianesimo, before Christianity. So this is an entire new category that no one, either before or after Dante, ever had the imagination, the audacity, and the interest to put into limbo. So what is it that Dante is doing? Limbo existed as you could almost think of it sociologically within theology. A sociology of limbo would indicate that it existed. It came about as a way to palliate, to mitigate the sufferings of hell for souls whom the laity could not tolerate thinking of being exposed to the torments of hell. And this is where the babies and the children come in. Limbo is an actual accommodation to the laity, that they don't have to think of their unbaptized babies and children actually being physically tormented. The only torment of limbo is that they're not in heaven. We know this is an accommodation because the ultimate accommodation was in 2007. Because over the centuries, what happened is that the laity couldn't even take any consolation from the idea of limbo at all. It was just simply unacceptable that a baby who was not baptized would be in the first circle of hell. And ultimately that pressure on the church resulted, as I explained, in the reforming of limbo. They don't say it doesn't exist, but they reformed it in a way that frankly gets rid of its basic function, which was as a place to mitigate the suffering of children. So who does Dante put in limbo? What captures his imagination? What is his punctum dolens? What is it that he's so upset about that he needs to use limbo as a way to make himself feel better? What's upsetting him are great thinkers, great poets, great philosophers, great souls who contributed enormously to human thought and human culture, and who never sinned in a positive sense, but of course they all sinned in the sense that Christianity holds that we all sin, which is we're born with original sin. Therefore, they can't be saved. Therefore, they are in limbo. So this is what Dante does in Inferno 4. He's going to go further still. Thank you. This is more pictures of Inferno 4. He's going to go further still, and he's going to save some pagans in the Divine Comedy. This is also quite remarkable because though theologians had the category of fides implicita, meaning that one could be saved by an infusion of implicit grace, they never gave much attention to this category. And with the exception of Emperor Trajan, about whom a legend had arisen that Pope Gregory the Great had prayed for him, and in that way he had been allowed to return to earth for a brief period in which he recognized Christ, then died again, this time saved. So there was that, the legend of Trajan tells you that there is an interest to that degree in saved pagans. Dante takes that interest and he goes much further because in his poem, he actually adds other saved pagans. So let's continue and see what Dante continues to do in this category. This is more examples of limbo, but in this one, he actually refers to one of the three Muslims in his limbo, which is 𝗗𝗵𝗁, which is why I don't say pagans, but say non-Christians, because there are three Muslims who I think would be wrong to categorize as pagans, a word I keep for classical antiquity. And then if we continue, this is a timeline. And the purpose of sharing this timeline is precisely with respect to those people on the far right, who are the three Muslims. So Boccaccio, in his commentary to the Inferno, he only got as far as Inferno 17, but he wrote extensively on Inferno 4. And Boccaccio is very interesting. He accepts the basic extraordinary deviation from orthodoxy, which is adult virtuous pagans in limbo. But you can see that it's concerning him because he has a whole section on how it's particularly worrisome to him that souls who lived after the birth of Christ should be put in limbo. Again, because limbo is a preferred status. And what Boccaccio says is, once you know about Christ, once there isn't the argument that you don't know, then really there's no excuse for putting you in limbo. This is, once I read Boccaccio, which was for some recent study I was doing on limbo, I realized how remarkable it is that Dante places those three Muslims on the far right of that timeline, because they lived so late in the Christian era. Boccaccio was already worried about Ovid, who died in 17 after the birth of Christ. He's worried because that's not quite right. They lived after Christ was born. They shouldn't be given this special status. And so that gives us, I think, a better understanding of how remarkable what Dante does with respect to Avicenna and Averroes and Saladino is. And then going on, I'm getting to the end, saved pagans, 𝗗𝗵𝗁 the Trojan. The idea that Rifeo, of whom we learn from 2 lines in the Aeneid, is somebody whom Dante saves. And then going on, here we have the eagle of justice in the heaven of justice, and the soul on the far right is 𝗗𝗵𝗁. And then one of those two, the two, you see 2 with crowns on the left. The first one of those is Trajan. I referred to the legend of Trajan, whereby it was believed that Gregory the Great had prayed for him enough to save him. So here we see Dante with both, this is Giovanni di Paolo's illustration, both Trajan and 𝗗𝗵𝗁 in the heaven of justice. So going on in the heaven of, this is another timeline showing you, it's just kind of funny. The the timeline of with respect to limbo stretches way out into the after Christ because of the 3 Muslims, and the timeline with respect to the saved pagans stretches way, way into the past because of the idea that 𝗗𝗵𝗗, the Trojan, is saved. And then the next one. So the man born on the banks of the Indus. In Paradiso 19, the same heaven of justice, where Dante tells us that 𝗗𝗵𝗗 and Trajan are both saved, he poses an extraordinary question. He says, a man is born on the banks of the Indus, un uomo nasce alla riva dell'Indo, e quivi non è chi ragioni di Cristo, né chi legga, né chi scriva. There's no one here who speaks of Christ, nor reads of Christ, nor writes of Christ. And in all of his actions, he is good. He has no sin in his life or in his words, but he dies not baptized. Muore non battezzato e senza fede. And then there are 2 extraordinary questions. Ove questa giustizia che lo condanna? Where is the justice that condemns him? Ove la colpa sua se e non crede? Where is his sin if he doesn't believe? This is the issue. We're in the heaven of justice. We're getting to the end of the Paradiso. Dante is still worried about the issue of justice with respect to those who do not have access to the teachings of Christ. And he goes so far, the same canto, next slide, to also say that there may be Ethiopians closer to Christ at the judgment day than many Christians. That's in the verses that follow there. And I take that passage in which Dante says that the Ethiopian will damn such Christians when they go separate ways, one to the saved and one to the damned, to show you one last slide from Deborah Strickland's book, which shows you how Ethiopians are imaged in contemporary iconography. In the bottom panel, you see an Ethiopian, among others, going to venerate Antichrist. And in the top panel, you see Ethiopians with those strange creatures on the left, who Strickland says are 𝗗𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵𝗵, which is one of the monstrous races. So I want, again, just to show you how far Dante's imagination takes him from contemporary iconography, in this case with respect to Ethiopians. And then in conclusion, the next, this just is one of my favorite images, so I had to bring it in. It's Giovanni di Paolo's image for Paradiso 33. So it's the last canto of the Divine Comedy, the canto of the Beatific Vision. What Giovanni di Paolo, I think with an incredible act of sympathetic intuition, sympathetic sympathy with respect to Dante, whom he's illustrating. In that passage in Paradiso 33, Dante has a very, very famous moment when he says that what he saw when he saw all the universe gathered together in one volume caused him more amazement than did the 25 centuries that have passed since Neptune was first amazed at the sight of the first ship. So looking at that illustration, you see Beatrice and Dante on the left. You see an icon of the Virgin Mary. That's because Paradiso 33 begins with Beatrice praying to the Virgin to allow Dante to proceed to the ultimate vision. And then you see that Giovanni di Paolo has unpacked Dante's image, where his amazement at what he saw is as great as the amazement or greater than the amazement of Neptune. And so what we end up with here is the Virgin Mary, the first ship, which is the Argo, the ship sailed by Jason and his crew, the Argonauts, and Neptune. And there they are on the same visual plane, the Virgin floating above that ancient green sea that has Neptune in it. And that image to me is so so symbolic of the Italian imagination that I used it on the cover of the book in the next and last slide, Dante and the Origins of Italian Literary Culture, because that juxtaposition of non-Christian with Christian, of secular with religious, is to me at the very heart of the Italian imagination. And Dante was certainly a pioneer in that direction.
Grazie mille, professoressa Barolini. Thank you so much. This was a really inspiring talk. I really love the way you use the visuals and how they complemented what you were saying. We have a very good number of questions from our audience. So if you don't mind, I'm going to read a few of these questions to you, and we'll try to answer to as many as possible, although I know that we are kind of running out of time. One interesting question that we have, it's from Bruce, and it goes back to the topic that you were discussing about homosexuality in Dante, and he's citing a history of the 14th century from Florence, which indicated that male homosexuality was basically normative. So he was wondering whether if Dante places homosexuals in Inferno and they are all Florentines, they're all from Florence, is this more of a slap at Florence rather than at homosexuals?
Well, it's interesting. Bruce I think has in mind a very well-known book about Florentine being actually considered the capital of homosexuality in Europe, but it's about a century or so later than Dante, the period that is discussed in that book. So I have never seen anything to indicate that it was normative in Dante's time. I'm just going to say I don't know the answer to that. I do know the book he's referring to, and it certainly became normative. So maybe the suggestion is that Dante doesn't use a sexualized torture for that reason, but I was trying to make the point that there's never a sexualized torture in the Divine Comedy. And that's why I use the Taddeo di Bartolo. So I'm sorry, I lost the filo of your question. What was I?
If it was more of a slap at, these Florentines who are put in hell rather than at people who are homosexuals, really.
Well, he certainly does use homosexuality to slap at Florentines. There's no doubt about that. In Canto 16, it's all about la terra prava of Florence and Florentine corruption because of the subiti guadagni and the mercantile and class and so forth. So both Canto 15 and 16 are devoted to Florence. But, that doesn't get us out of the problem that he did come up with the classification of sodomy as a sin worthy of being in hell. He does do that.
Right. Thank you. And so I'm going now to the question, to a question by Rebecca, which is kind of, she says it herself, an old question. Then why doesn't Dante save Virgilio, since he saved other people who were not Christians?
Well, he saves other people who are not Christians. The fact that he does that only adds to the poignancy of the story of Virgilio. I would put it exactly the other way around. How do you build tension into a text whose storyline is 100% overdetermined? You know where everybody is from the beginning. He finds remarkable ways of creating tension in his readers and making them feel in a way that is against the grain of the doctrinal message. And one of the ways he does that is making sure that his readers fall in love with Virgilio, not saving Virgilio. And in that way, making the question of the virtuous pagan one that we should all be considering from the point of view of the justice of it. The man born on the banks of the Indus, that's what he's saying. He's saying that man, that passage from Paradiso 19, defining the man born on the banks of the Indus as good in all his actions, it could be a description of Virgilio. He's actually interested in the category. He uses his narrative art to make us care. And in this case, he makes us care because we fall in love with Virgilio. However, you could almost say that maybe his narrative art is too brilliant, because then we start saying things like, well, why isn't Virgilio saved? Again, he was actually interested in the category of why is it fair for people who had no access to be damned?
Thank you. Very, very interesting answer. And I'm going now to a question by Patricia, who is asking you, Professoressa, talking about the circle of loss and Francesca's deception. What did Dante think of rape? How did he rank rape? Was it even acknowledged in the Middle Ages?
So the closest he comes to the issue of, he doesn't really have, I mean, 𝗗𝗄𝗏 is abducted. Rapire does not mean rape there. It means abduct, right? Mm-hmm. And the category of raptus was considered wrongful, but there wasn't a sharp distinction. I wish she were here. My former student, Grace Del Molino, who has studied canon law, can go into all of the specifics about the different canonists on this topic. But in terms of Dante's imaginary world, I will say this: the closest he comes, I believe, in the Divine Comedy to giving portrayals of the experience of violence, sexual violence, is in the treatment of the thieves, the ladri, in Inferno 24 and 25. When you consider the descriptions of the way the snakes attack the men, it's really, as was argued a long time ago in Estetica dell'Osceno, it's really deeply pornographic and deeply troubling language. And in fact, he is describing rapes, it seems to me.
Right, thank you. And one more question from Tom, who is referring to some of the images that you showed, and especially the frescoes and some of the paintings. I was wondering if you know about some of them, if they were commissioned, if so, by the church, and how come were they pushed so much to the extreme when Dante doesn't actually do that in the.
Okay, what I'm trying to explain is that the extreme is normative. That with respect to sexuality, and really honestly, I think this is true in most cultures throughout history, people have immensely punitive imaginations when it comes to sexual sin. Okay, the extreme is the normative. This one Dante is the outlier here. He's absolutely an outlier. What Giotto, the 𝗗𝗏𝗵𝗶𝗵𝗶 chapel, this is not an outlier. This is the last judgment of Giotto, for goodness sakes. This is absolutely typical of the imagination with respect to sexual sin. And it has a tradition of at least 1,000 years in the Christian tradition. I'm sure it has even longer ones in other traditions. I don't remember what Hammurabi's law has to say about sexual sin, but I doubt it's any better.
Thank you. And perhaps one last question to kind of wrap up the presentation, which is also something that many people asked us before this program. What inspired Dante to write in vernacular rather than in Latin?
Well, that's a very interesting question. Dante wrote three texts in Latin. He wrote the De Vulgari Eloquentia in Latin. his treatise on language, in which he begins by saying, nobilior est vulgaris, the vernacular is more noble, which is quite fascinating that he takes Latin as the opportunity to claim the superiority of the vernacular. He also in later life wrote his eclogues in Latin and his Quaestio de aqua de terra, a kind of philosophical work. So he was capable of using Latin as the vehicle for learned communication, as was typical for many centuries and still after Dante. Dante was a poet. No matter how great a philosopher he was, and he was a great philosopher. He has many scientific inclinations also, but he was a poet. And he was, all you have to do is look at what Dante wrote when he was young. He began to write very young in the vernacular. And I think he must have realized quite early that he had a gift that would allow the vernacular to come to a kind of flowering that had never been seen before. He's torn in the Convivio. He's going back toward philosophy, but even there he's practicing the vernacular because he develops that muscular philosophical prose in the Italian vernacular that he develops in the Convivio. But frankly, I just don't think you can have that kind of poetic gift and refuse it.
Right. And after, listening to your presentation, may I just add that I was thinking perhaps one of the reasons why he decided to, not use Latin for his poem was also the fact that he was trying to find a sort of new language to express new ideas, because as you demonstrated during this presentation, many of the contents of the Commedia are not normative.
Well, let me say what I should have said that's also part of what you're saying. He wanted to teach. He wanted to reach people. He had a message. Leaving aside even the non-normative, there's also, I just want to save you, right? So just like, if you have a message and you care very, very strongly about that message, you want to write it in the language that can reach the most possible number of people. It's interesting though, because I just finished writing an essay on limbo called Dante's Limbo and Equity of Access. But the way you formulated that made me think that equity of access is also the issue for him as a poet. How can people know? They can only know if they can read it.
Right. That's very interesting. Professoressa, I cannot thank you enough. I cannot say grazie enough for you sharing this time with us during this afternoon or evening or other time zone. People just made me notice that they are attending from South Africa even. So grazie mille for kicking off our celebrations of Dante for this year. I just would like to take the opportunity to remind our audience our next appointment is going to be another presentation by Alessandro Barbero, hosted by the Italian Cultural Institute in San Francisco on February the 25th. More details will be announced soon. Professoressa, grazie again. Thank you everyone for attending this program today. Arrivederci.